Right, while we're waiting for the last people to come in, just then a couple of practical notes. At the conclusion of the conversation, there's a reception upstairs in the 1939 lobby, and there will also be, the bookstore has made books available for purchase. There are signed copies already of Bernard Shumi's new book, Architecture Concepts, Red is Not a Color, which is a vast tome, so if you buy one, you might need help to carry it out, but it's already signed. And there are also copies of Mark Wigley's rather hard to find, The Architecture of Deconstruction. I'm sure if you ask him nicely, he will sign it, and likewise the same for Peter Eisenman's book, 10 Canonical Buildings, 1950 to 2000, of a couple of years ago, as well as some recent architecture and design department exhibition catalogs. There are a handful of seats up in the front if you're looking. Go ahead. So I think we'll start. As most of you know, I'm Barry Bergdahl, the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design here at MoMA, and it's a real pleasure that there was such a extraordinarily good response to this event that was put together to be not so much a birthday celebration, but rather a kind of informal conversation and a reflection on the occasion of what turned out to be the 25th anniversary of the seminal show curated by my title's namesake, Philip Johnson, and Mark Wigley, who will lead our conversation tonight. Before I turn it over to him, I wanted just to give you a little bit of background on this. Last fall, when Klaus Biesenbach and I set out to take our turn at the trimestral renewal of the contemporary galleries on the second floor of the museum, a task that falls each 4 months to a different duo of chief curators from the museum's 7 departments, we decided that the section on 1980s painting, sculpture, and video art might be accompanied by a room devoted to architectural developments of the period. I hope you had a chance to see what we came up with before tonight's program, or if not, that tonight's discussion will motivate you to go and take a look. We worked hard to make some interesting juxtapositions across media, and at the same time, I worked at creating a room that had some historical resonance, rather than simply a presentation of the very diverse body of work from the 1980s that is held in the museum's permanent collection of architecture. The 1980s is never the easiest period for this museum to represent, particularly in architecture, as MoMA was deeply ambivalent at the time on how to respond to the emergence of full-blown postmodernism, even if the publication by the museum in 1966 of Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture had played a major, even catalytic role in the development of at least American postmodernism. Indeed, throughout the 1980s, in the waning days of Arthur Drexler's long tenure as director of the Department of Architecture and Design, and his replacement by Stuart Rada in 1987, the department wavered, some said rudderless, showing Ricardo Bofill and Leon Krier one year and mounting a centennial exhibition on Mies van der Rohe the next, followed in the next year in 1987 by a monograph on Mario Botta, that one year before the event we are here tonight to talk about. Decidedly, the only seminal effort at making a coherent statement, self-consciously aiming to make an impact like the legendary so-called international style show more than a half-century earlier, was the exhibition Deconstructivist Architecture, co-curated by Philip Johnson and Mark Wigley in the summer of 1988. It is actually very much like the international style show when you look on the exhibition calendar, extraordinary to realize that an event that has such a, that is stuck in everyone's memory and has such kind of aura and an allure was on the walls for just a little over 6 weeks, both of them extraordinarily short-termed exhibitions with extraordinary long-reaching shadows, which is what I think we're here to talk about tonight. This show left the most cohesive body of material in the permanent collection, although it is to be regretted that a few of the key projects presented there did not remain behind, such as Peter Eisenman's Center for the University of Frankfurt, which escaped the grasp of the department. You'll notice in the exhibition that Peter is actually represented with a much earlier work, which I think it would be interesting to discuss whether it seems out of place in this current hang. Still, with the recent acquisition of one of the few remaining prints of Rem Koolhaas and OMA's 1982 Rotterdam project, it was possible to represent each of the 7 protagonists in that now legendary exhibition, and thus to evoke it for a new generation of visitors. Yes, a generation, because while we were working on the installation plan, it suddenly occurred to me that 2013 would mark the 25th anniversary of the show. At just that moment, Bernard Tschumi presented me with a copy of his mega new book, which you'll see momentarily, Architecture Concepts, Red is Not a Color, which includes a retrospective view over the last several decades of his practice between theory and building. In 1988, when the show was presented at MoMA, Tschumi was celebrating the completion of his first major built work, the Parc de la Villette, won in competition in 1982, and completed, at least for its first phases, I think, in 87. That fall, he took over the reins of the Columbia School of Architecture, where he was dean from 1988 to 2003, when he was succeeded by Mark Wigley. Today, of course, Tschumi has a major corpus of built work, much of which is presented in the mega book. It suddenly occurred to me that it would be interesting to have a conversation about the show and the critical avalanche it unleashed in 1988, seen from the perspective of 2013. It wasn't possible to imagine a total reunion and call together all 7 of the architects included, nor is our aim here a reunion or even simply to reminisce, although there is still a fair amount of intrigue around the show that is not abundantly clear. Between those who thought their ideas had been preempted, Johnson quickly thanks them in the acknowledgments. To those who were not included, they are alluded to in the preface. Rather, it seemed worth looking back at one of the great debates of the period when architectural theory was blossoming in architectural schools in a way that would have a profound effect on the development of the discipline and the practice of architecture, as well as on the curricula of schools of architecture and even the contours of the discourse on architecture. How then do we judge that show historically now in retrospect, and what aspects of its claims and positions have been borne out in subsequent work? As with so many group shows, particularly those that seek to assert a shared sensibility, a style, held by a diverse group of practitioners, the definition seems at once continually in the making and continually threatening to unsew itself before our very eyes. Just as the 1932 show that gave rise to the international style term and the publication in 1975 by the Museum of 5 Architects created groupings that were immediately challenged as reductive or unconvincing in some way, so the deconstructivist show's grouping of 7 figures was challenged almost immediately as it was announced in a press release of March 1988. I thought you might enjoy hearing, in conclusion to my simply opening the stage remarks, the way the press department tried to make sense of that complex set of thoughts that Wigley was developing in one of his first major publications, as well as the happy-go-lucky desire to stir the pot that was Philip Johnson's glee in curating the first show at MoMA since his departure in 1948 from the head of the department he had founded in 1932. So I quote the press release. Deconstructivist architecture focuses on 7 international architects whose recent works marks the emergence of a new sensibility in architecture. The architects recognize the imperfectibility of the modern world and seek to address, in Johnson's words, the, quote, pleasures of unease. Obsessed with diagonals, arcs, and warped planes, they intentionally violate the cubes and right angles of modernism. Their projects continue the experimentation with structure initiated by the Russian constructivists, but the goal of perfection of the 1920s is subverted. The traditional virtues of harmony, unity, and clarity are displaced by disharmony, fracturing, and mystery. The exhibition includes drawings, models, and site plans for recent projects by Coop Himmelblau, Peter Eisenman, Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, Rem Koolhaas, Daniel Liebeskind, and Bernard Tschumi. Their works are preceded by an introductory section of constructivist paintings and sculptures drawn from the museum's collection. And here you can see just 4 black and white photographs of the exhibition design, exhibition installation. It is quite remarkable that for some reason the museum did not, until 5 years ago, begin to take installation shots in color. And so whatever role the colored walls, they're clearly not white, might have played and the architecture of the exhibition is nowhere to be discerned. Now, I suspect it could well be that the juxtaposition of Russian constructivism with the series of projects assembled was the least convincing aspects of the claims that were put forth, and that it was all rather cavalierly done to fulfill Johnson's desire, as he said, find me some slashing diagonals in the collection. But still, I think to go into that small gallery where we have juxtaposed just some of the architectural work of the period is to really feel and see how seminal those projects were, and how they They do still, in fascinating ways, dialogue with one another. I know that Frederica Taylor, I think she's here tonight, who served as the in-house coordinator of the show, could no doubt also illuminate us on many aspects of how the event played itself out between the internal politics of the museum, Philip Johnson, the invited curator, and the unsuspecting architects who were part of this scheme. We will begin with presentations by Mark Wigley, co-curator with Philip Johnson of the show and author of the text in the catalog. Mark has, long out of print, Mark has kindly agreed both to offer his thoughts on one of his own first works as an architectural theorist, critic, and curator, a valiant willingness to engage his own œuvre de jeunesse. Mark, in turn, will present two of the show's 7 protagonists, Peter Eisenman, who needs no more introduction now than he did then. He was, along with Frank Gehry, the senior statesman of the group and one who had pioneered a theoretic architectural discourse, led in part through exhibitions at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, which had closed its doors 3 years earlier, I'd say left a void in New York, but which had, among so many other things, been the crucible in which so many of the ideas debated in the show were formulated, since nearly everyone in the show had been involved in that legendary think tank on 41st Street, Bernard Tschumi, of course, included. I'm delighted that all 3 of them have so graciously and enthusiastically agreed to participate this evening. We will do our best to spare a good amount of time at the end for discussion, and I invite you afterwards, as I said, for a short reception and book signing of books by all of our 3 architect guests, as well as catalogs from our own recent exhibitions. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll turn it over to Mark and join you in these very modernist Barcelona chairs.
Okay, so a few words. So it's almost 25 years ago. People are now doing PhDs on the show, which normally means that it's something so dead that it's safe for historians to bring it back. So this would mean that tonight is some sort of memorial at the scene of the crime, literally. Digging the show up for an autopsy, maybe? If so, it's really odd to have asked us to do the autopsy. It's a kind of zombie episode of CSI. So we are like zombie pathologists who've been asked to do an autopsy on our own past. Or perhaps the situation is a little bit trickier. Maybe the show is more alive now than it was even at the time, more alive than ever. Maybe it got revived by what came afterwards, or more precisely, what did not come afterwards. The absence of a similarly cathartic event, a kind of census of the discipline, or a kind of medical checkup, which is part of, I think, what this show was about. And if that's the case, if something like this didn't happen in the last 25 years, then actually if the event of 25 years ago changes, and its meaning changes, and it evolves, maybe gets more alive. Maybe we are no longer in the age of galvanizing shows or books or even people. Maybe we're in a time of countless micro-adjustments, micro-blogs and tweets, and any kind of nostalgia for a sort of Uber show is just a kind of loss of sensitivity to the world that we live in today. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe the field of architecture is totally asleep and needs to be woken up again, and that was definitely the feeling at the time, that the field was asleep and needed to be woken up. Whatever it is, I think it's super important to remember that what we're talking about tonight is an architectural project. Exhibitions are always architectural projects, not simply because it's a spatial design, a kind of room within a room that's designed to have an effect on the people who inhabit it, but much more that an exhibition is a multi-dimensional performance aimed at making an articulate statement. And I stay with the kind of more or less classical understanding of architecture as articulate building, as architecture that makes a statement. The reverse, of course, is also true, that all architectural projects are some kind of exhibition. It's just that maybe exhibitions are the most focused architectural medium of all, and this might have been a super focused example, a super focused exhibition. It was, to say the least, super polemical. A very particular set of very, very different projects was made to say, by virtue of the instrument of the exhibition, the same thing. So a series of very different architects doing very different things were made to seem as if they were saying the same thing. So the show was super focused, not so much in the sense of zooming in on a point, but actually zooming out from a point, seeing what a single point could do to the field if you exaggerated that. And I think we could talk tonight about, what was that focus, what was that point. But even then, I think it's important to remember that the content of an exhibition is not simply what's in the gallery or what's written on the wall or the extended media cloud within which this appears and is reflected upon, or even the specific point that is being made. The content, the real content of an exhibition, it seems to me, is the displacement that it produces in the critics themselves, the curators, the designers, the institution, the visitors, the readers, and so on. Architecture, which is of course the art that seems to move the least, has always as its ambition to move, to produce a sense of movement. So the question is, what kind of movement did this show produce, which may have nothing to do with what was in the show or what was intended by the show. Certainly a big part of the polemic of this particular exhibition was to revive the very idea of a polemical exhibition. I mean, that was actually part of the project. Philip wanted to shake the museum up. I would hazard the thought that he was more interested to shake the museum up than he was interested to shake the field up. Now, of course, for him, the museum and the field are, one gives way to the other, but if he had a choice, a sort of dark choice, a devil's contract, could you really annoy the museum or really annoy the field of architecture? I think he might well choose the museum as his target. For me, of course, this meant it was a fantastic terrorist assignment. It was a real pleasure and a privilege to work with Philip, and a particular privilege to work here in this place. Philip was super supportive and gave an almost unlimited license to make trouble. Never will experience that again. Never would offer it to anyone else either. For me, for what it's worth, the idea was to create a kind of a hyper-focus, a kind of, let's say, acupuncture point or an intense, very controversial hotspot around which all the discourses in architecture could gather and vent. And vent they did. Everybody had their opinion, good or bad, generally either super good or super bad, nobody in the middle. Everybody, and I mean absolutely everybody, the caretakers of the caretakers of the caretakers, thought that they understood the situation perfectly. I've never seen such a storm of expertise at any one moment. And yet I thought so little was understood in what was said. It was actually amazing what was said, and a real lesson. More or less all the same people see it all very differently now, good or bad. Looking back, the remarkable trajectory of these 7 architects since the show seems like inevitable, and there's that chicken and egg question, was the show interesting because those were interesting architects? Did they become interesting because of the show? This kind of problem. It's worse than that, though. It seems like the show is already becoming a monument, and in a sense, all of our thoughts are rendered, therefore, irrelevant in the face of this monumental image. But I would say again that the point all along was not for the future of the work or for the future of the architects in the show, but the future of the discourse. In fact, for me, it was a historical exhibition, and I said so repeatedly at the time here in this museum. The idea was to use the Museum of Modern Art, being the museum of record, to document some important work of the previous 10 years, and as I repeatedly insisted, so that a new generation could then step in. But without marking the work that had occurred, it made it more difficult for the next work to be produced, whether by other people or by the very same architects. I've come to think that only Daniel Libeskind thought that the show was about the future, and it still seems to be designing for the show, and that seems to be not a good idea. It was a historical show, not in the sense of making a historical argument, but in the sense of making a strategic documentation about the work of an immediately preceding phase. it was at the same time as being historical in the sense it was about reviving the very idea, the kind of avant-garde impulse. It was, of course, defending the idea of the avant-garde. You could almost say something like there was a kind of a thinking of history itself, or at least of the historical impulse, the thought that the historical impulse can be used as an avant-garde tool. And of course I would insist it's almost always used that way. The unstated enemy was unambiguously, of course, so unambiguously that it was never stated, postmodernism. The show focused on a kind of ghost of the Russian avant-garde lurking within generic modernism to make a point about the relationship between structure and ornament, a point about structure and ornament that was understood to be a kind of poison pill to every single brand of postmodernism, of which there are so many, but it was meant to be a multi-purpose drug capable of toxic effects across the entire range of postmodern discourse, which was at that time thoroughly academic in the old sense. The show used a set of architects to make this point, and I would say the set of architects used the show to make their own points in their own career. It was anyway not really a selection of 7 architects, but the selection of a set of projects. I would say that every architect was happy to be in the show, but every architect wanted to be seen as the odd man in, or the odd woman in. That is to say, the only one that didn't really belong with all the others, whose natural brilliance surely was obviously transcended the other creatures in the room. But they were all connected in several ways. One, I think, most importantly, was a shared knowledge in that group about the Russian avant-garde. In almost every case, is significant amount of time collecting, studying, visiting, thinking about that work. They were also linked, I think, by connections to the Institute and to the Architectural Association. There were ways in which this group could be thought of together. It was, as Barry said, a summer show, which means, of course, that architecture was not prime time. The museum gave the off-season to architecture, but it was 3 galleries, which is serious firepower in the Museum of Modern Art. I mean, 3 galleries in the Museum of Modern Art is an extraordinary amount of space to make a point with. My own experience was to discover with great pleasure that the Museum of Modern Art, and I'm sure still is a total expert on all the little details, all of the micro details of exhibitions that have ideological impacts, the protocols of labels, displays, and so on. I remember a 3-hour conversation about whether the flowers in the garden could be red or blue, and I had strong arguments against both. So after 3 hours of negotiation was an agreement that for the first time in the history of the museum there would be red and blue flowers at the same time, because it was understood the role that the flowers could play. So as I learned that the expert was, the museum was totally expert in the ideological impact of little details, this became totally thrilling for me, and I became an expert at getting around the museum in order to do the things that I wanted to do. For example, I consider one of the greatest victories the fact that against considerable odds, the cover of the catalogue is a fax image. And it's not by accident, seems to me, that show documents the high point of the fax and its role in architecture. And I would argue that an exhibition devoted to the role of the fax machine in architectural discourse may well have been even more provocative and even more to the point. But the fact that against the museum we were able to get a fax of an image sent from an architect from across the Atlantic while working on a project, to have that as the cover image is the kind of pathetic battle that was the greatest pleasure in my life to win. The whole question of deconstruction, deconstructivist, I guess we're going to talk about that. I always insist, and will still do so, on the enormous gap between the two. Nothing can be more or less deconstructive than anything else. Deconstruction, you cannot have a deconstructive architecture. Deconstruction is a structural condition, or more particularly, it's a way of thinking about the condition of structure. It's a reflection upon the nature of structure. Nevertheless, I am of the view that this work that I would argue uses, consciously or not, the ghost of the Russian avant-garde to infect the generic orthogonal fantasies predominant in architecture, to raise questions about structure. this work is the kind of work that you're interested in if you're interested in deconstruction. So it's not an example of deconstructive theory at work, but it's the kind of thing that deconstruction is curious about, hence that very blurred label, deconstructivist. It happens that the three of us sitting here tonight were the only ones involved in the exhibition who were deeply familiar with Derrida and the possible implications of that work in the field. So actually it's one of the reasons why I think this is not a bad group to get together. It would be interesting to think, if we were to add one more person to the group, who would that person be? And I would add Kohlhaas, because I think it would be the theorists of the group that, as you, Barry, point out, this is a clearly has something to do with the history of the operations of so-called theory. But since we happen to be the ones that knew quite a bit about deconstruction, in most cases considerably more than the cloud of experts that immediately appeared, perhaps it does make sense that we would be the zombie pathologists here tonight, or at least that we can start some kind of conversation, hopefully with not too much nostalgia. And I can't remember who goes first. Bernard.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And how does it work? Right, perfect. Good. No, this is fine. Please stay. Perfect. Right. Good. Okay. I've written some notes in order to be shorter and more precise. It starts by saying sites. I know my friend Peter Eisenman tells his students, don't go and see the site or the immediate context. But one needs to talk about the site of what has been called deconstructivism, about the site of deconstruction, and about the present. So first, deconstructivist architecture. Decon, for those who absolutely want to see it as a style. What was the site of the exhibition of Johnson and Wigley at MoMA? So let's go back to history. In history, 1968, the discredit of many of the permanent values of corporate modernism, as well as the critical excessive of some utopia of the time, were immediately followed by a conservative reactions in the 70s and by the rise of historicism, i.e. architectural postmodernism. So much that in 1980, Strada Novissima at the Venice Biennale confirmed a new style with Robert A.M. Stearns, Paolo Portuguesi, Stanley Tigerman, and many others. 1984, Philip Johnson's AT&T building was inaugurated. It had got the cover of Time magazine, and throughout the 80s, Paul Goldberger advocated the new style in the columns of the New York Times. Meanwhile, a few mavericks, misfits from two generations were doing something slightly different. Maybe they were old time because since they believed in the contemporary and in progress instead of the return of the past. In a sense, this general conservatism around them was the immediate site of the work of these 7 or 8 people. In a way, their work both preceded and reacted to the historical postmodernist context in which they operated. It preceded because it wanted to extend the spirit of invention characterized by the 20th century. It reacted because it was deeply oppositional, confrontational in relation to the rest of their era of humanist, classicist, historicist, illusionist architecture. Above all, their work never had the intent to become a style of deconstructivism. They also came from vastly different backgrounds and motivations. My second point, of course, is not about the ism of deconstructivism, but about the site of deconstruction. Deconstruction did not come out of the blue. It was part of a whole philosophical and critical culture, from Foucault to Barthes, from Deleuze to Genet to Derrida or Lacan. It was also invented, or rather developed, as a reaction against certain philosophical cliches or received ideas, in particular binary oppositions commonly used by philosophers: signifier, signified, passive, active, perceived, conceived, etc. Derrida had argued that one of the terms always dominates the other, hence the need to reverse these hierarchies. Ultimately, it meant creating new concepts to establish different interactions and so on. Derrida also opposed the notion of generations, suggesting that issues and philosophical problems do not change overnight the way that styles do. So my point is not to give a course in deconstruction, although it would be instructive to extend such a critique to binary thoughts in architectural theory: solid and void, figure and ground, vertical and horizontal, inside and outside, presence and absence, and so on. Architects could then question the implied hierarchy between these terms and the catalogue of received ideas that goes with them. So my last point. Beyond these fine points of site and cultural context, my last point is about the present. There are still too many stylistic and imagistic amalgam floating around in architecture. Say, you, as an architect, decide to make your work an investigation of foundational myth in architecture. Say, you want to re-examine those foundations, those imperatives of architecture, not looking at styles and forms, but looking, say, at concept, or at materials, or at envelopes. Chances are that your work will inevitably be seen through the lenses of styles and forms. In this room, not 25 years ago, but 17 or 18, I showed my project for Le Fresnoy to a small audience. The project is a double envelope over an existing building. Philip Johnson came to me after the talk, praised the work, and said then, "But Bernard, when are we going to see your shapes?" So I replied, "Philip, I do not do shapes." Of course, my interest is not so much about shapes themselves. It is about the eventual capacity of architecture to reposition itself within society, about architecture as the invention of concepts before it becomes a display of images or the experience of affects. As Barry nicely mentioned, there's book signing later this evening, and I thought I would take not too many slides, but just to explain a little further. So let me try. Yes, oops, that's perfect. Right, okay. The book is about 5 concepts, or 5 questions rather. And for me, there are still fundamental questions in architecture that needs to be raised. Some of them I've tried to raise. They're kind of fundamental questions that still need to be investigated. And they have little to do with style. One has to do with space, events, and movements. In other words, what happens in a building is just as important as what it looks like. Of course, the Parc de la Villette is all about social space and a way to restructure an experience of the urban realm. Here I bring, I think, a very important and often overlooked question, which is that 6 years before the La Villette competition was the project on the right, an idea competition, not for the real thing, but simply ideas, were an extraordinary project that had a major influence on a whole generation. It was by Leon Creer, and indeed was very much part of that, to our mind, conservative, historicist rediscovery of the 18th century. And it could be argued that the competition, which had 437 or whatever competitors, for some of the members, like some of the competitors, like Rem Koolhaas and myself, were not against one another, but against Leon Krier, that has, preceded us with a very influential project. So, in many ways, each of these are themes. So the second theme is the issue of program, and program inevitably has to do with the juxtaposition of what happens in a building and the building itself, but it has also to do with typologies, whether it was the typology of Aldo Rossi or the typologies of Frank Lloyd Wright. In other words, what is that relationship between what happens and what it does? Lefrenois that I mentioned was indeed how to design something without designing, how juxtaposing strategically certain parts in order to avoid to be caught with. Third theme, the vectors and envelopes. Architecture has been for a long time discussed in terms of facades and vertical planes, horizontal planes. As soon as you bring the notion of envelopes, that dialectic disappears. And as soon as you bring the notion of vectors, immediately you take away one of those crutches of architecture, in other words, history. Vectors and envelopes are ahistorical. So, of course, some example where one explores that realm of the envelope, where there's no more distinction between what the roof and the elevation. So, next theme, concept, context, content. In other words, saying that maybe just as there may be certain tension between a program and a building, a space, there is certain tensions between a context and the building itself. In other words, it's not quite the same to build a building on top of archaeological remnants and in front of the Acropolis, or building on a free space somewhere in Long Island. Immediately, there's certain questions that are raised which have to do with the nature of architecture itself. Take a competition for the World Trade Center, whether it is a memorial skyscraper in Las Vegas or a house of reconciliation between cultures, is not the same building. And finally, concept form, because after so many years of saying form is not what one wants to deal with, you realize that there are certain projects that you cannot do without integrating or bringing the abstract exterior outside notion of form. Whether you do project in Saudi Arabia or project in China, this has been very much one of the questions that has been raised recently. There is no context, then what is the form? And so certain example of those very strategic projects, and then inevitably you ask your question of the formless, and that's the last project. Again, a park, interestingly enough. It's a zoo, it's architecture for animals, and these are the themes that are. Why do I bring this notion of themes? Is that, again, I do not think that the issues that were brought in the Deconstructivist show were only issues that had to do with what it looked like. I'm quite convinced that was one of the triggers that, excited Philip. But in many ways, underlying it, there were a number of themes that were part of a fairly serious research on the part of actually all 7 protagonists. Namely, themes that I would say transcend the period in which they were shown, but that are as valid 50 years before or 70 years before. That's why the analogy with the constructivist era is not a bad one, or with even questions which today are not yet resolved and that are part of an ongoing search.
I find it really interesting that MoMA still has these quaint public address things you can't use hands for gestures. You have to hold the damn thing. I haven't had one of these in my hand in a long time, and to have it here at MoMA. But nevertheless, first of all, memories are clouded, and so what we're hearing tonight is not so much a backstory, is in fact how we might like to think we remember what was going on then. First of all, there was a fabulous backstory, which is not for tonight, because we're looking at the forward story from it, but there is a backstory. Very similar to the backstory that was Philip's International Style Show in '33, and Philip's intentions then, and Philip's intentions for this show. And I think he is the great arbiter who's not here tonight. We have to remember that while all times are ideological, and certainly the ideas of sustainability today have projected an ideological conservative time, even though one might not think that sustainability is an ideological subject. I think it is. That we were involved in an ideological time, although I think a very innocent one. There had been two very important post-modernist shows, one Roma Inter Rota of 1978, and followed up by Strada Novissima in 1980 at what has now been labeled the first International Biennale, which of course it wasn't, but that's another backstory. The important thing was that it was so ideological, Roma Inter Rota, that the architectural critic Manfredo Tafuri called me personally from Italy and said, "You must not go into this exhibition." And that it was very important that certain people not participate. And in fact, I think it's not apocryphal or out of the way that after Aldo Rossi went into the show, I think Tafuri had very little to do with Rossi after that 1980 show. To fast forward, it's important to understand that Mark and I did have a previous history. Mark had written a PhD thesis, which I was an external examiner for. I would like to think that the word deconstructivist never entered that particular thesis, but I could be wrong. In my memory, that word appears suddenly. The real term that was on the table at the time was deconstructionist, and the sort of fabrication of constructivism and deconstruction to put it together to soften the ideological thrust, I think, was a confection brewed here at MoMA. I don't know how it happened, but number one, I never have used the term in any of my writing deconstructivist. I've always used deconstruction or deconstructionist, and I'm not certain what that means even today. I would say it's accurate, as Mark has said, that the three of us probably most represent people that would say, I'll sign up for that label as opposed to the others. Although I'm not sure what we were signing up for, I know that Bernard had worked with Jacques Derrida, introduced me to Derrida, and there is a connection between Bernard, Mark, and myself, which plays out, I think, more importantly, in the deconstruction as opposed to the constructivist side of that story. I think Rem, if you want Rem, you would, and Zaha, you could say that's constructivism, but I wouldn't have put Rem in my fourth chair here. There are other people in the room that I think could sit in the fourth chair, but I wouldn't be Rem. But that's not neither here nor there. What I think is very important to understand, They were ideological times. They were things that people fought over. There were people who were not included in the exhibition, who wanted in, even though they had nothing to do with deconstruction. Even half the people who were in the show had nothing to do with the term deconstruction, and still don't. And so I think it's appropriate because Bernard, Mark, and myself, in very different ways, have, in a sense, elaborated ideas first put forward in the term deconstruction or the term post-structuralism. And we have to realize that we're not talking about Michel Foucault and Roland Barthes necessarily, although Barthes may be a hinge figure, but these people were structuralists, and Derrida, Deleuze, Lacan, others were post-structuralists. And I recommend to any of you who want a good read, a book that Tony Vidler recommended to me recently, a new biography of Jacques Derrida, which is a stunning recapitulation of what was going on in the political, ideological, university realms at both in France and in New Haven and various places, especially as far as what's interesting me, the reaction to Derrida's presence along with Paul de Man and others at Yale. So there were ideological wars that were taking place in the university over this particular subject. There certainly was one when it was bruited about that Jacques Derrida should be given an honorary doctorate in England, and there was a lot of anxiety about that because, in fact, England stands very much still today as what I would call the heartbeat of phenomenology, which is one of the poles of architecture that seems to have survived the postmodernist impulse and very much standing against what I would say is the deconstructionist or conceptualist impulses that are probably on this platform tonight. What did happen, and the reason why I say there was a certain innocence, there's no question that it was the death knell of postmodernism. Suddenly all of those people that were championing postmodernism suddenly disappeared, and we took over the stage, as it were. Not that we were successful as to what it was that we had in mind, and especially if you look at the excesses of what are now today called deconstructivism, and some of our colleagues are responsible for those excesses, you'd say, oh my goodness, can we get back to architecture? One of the interesting things about the exhibition was that it was about architecture. The ideological struggles were about the question of sign and signified, of free-floating signifiers, of transcendental signifiers, of all kinds of issues that engage the discourse and discipline of architecture and were worth struggling over at the time. And I think that it was important because of clearing the air from what had become a very stagnant situation after the Portuguese exhibition. No question that Portuguese's exhibition was the high point of postmodernism. There's no doubting that Michael Graves' Portlandia building was the high point of postmodernism in this country, the high watermark. Also sponsored by Philip Johnson, by the way. It was Philip who chose Michael's project. And I think when postmodernism suffered its first defeat is when Michael's Whitney Museum was rejected. His diptych project, which was a very, very important postmodernist project, was rejected by the Whitney, sort of opened the door for a new way of thinking. And if you look around New York, you look at London, for example, which was never had really a strong postmodernism. London looks like a modern city today, and with the recent spate of buildings in New York with Jean Nouvel and Norman Foster, Renzo Piano, etc., we're beginning to see a certain kind of modernism reappearing. I don't know what we would call it, but certainly it's not postmodernism. And I think that whatever Philip had in mind, and we will never know what he had really in mind, whether he was for it or against it, and he was never for or against anything too long. But he was always a jump ahead of everybody. And I would say that Philip's Klein Laboratory building at Yale was the first postmodernist building built in this country. And it was a copy, direct copy from Hans Polzig's tower of 1939, which only Philip would know because he was in Germany at the time. It was a book published by Theodor Heuss on Polzig, which never arrived in this country because it appeared in 39, and Philip probably had one of the few copies of that book. And if you look at the Klein building and you look at Polzig's tower, which was a premonition of what was to come, you find a very, very interesting conjugation, let's say. So I think it's great that we can discuss these things here tonight. I don't think that any of the people here are being disembodied or having an autopsy performed. We were strangely resilient at the time. I don't think that anybody thought that show was a great roaring success. I mean, the commentaries that we had were more of horror than they were of oh, we love this new stuff. They may not have loved the stuff, but the medicine seemed to take in a certain kind of way. So I think it's great, Barry, that even though the projects that are up there are not the projects from the show, the fact that it's symbolic of the people that were there, and certainly if you look at who the people were then and where they are now, and that includes, I think, all of us. I mean, Mark Wigley was wet behind the ears, and he's now a longtime dean at Columbia. I remember, how wet behind the ears you were. So we can seem suave and sophisticated tonight, but it weren't always that way. But anyway, Barry, thanks very much.
So Peter, you described the situation before the show as sort of stagnation. Mm-hmm. What's your current description for the environment in architecture today? 2.0. Stagnation again?
Yeah, stagnation 2.0.
But does that call for a show?
Well, I think it always calls for a show.
So you would.
I wouldn't know what that show would be, by the way.
Right.
But I'm certain if you and Barry got together, you could figure it out.
Well, the implication would be you have to find somebody very wet between the ears, right? But
there are a lot of them.
No, but do you? There's a lot of water around the United States. Would you, in your mind, think wouldn't it be good to do have a show like that to deal with the current situation?
I think if we had more, look, there was a time in Europe, there was a show at ArtNet of the Five. There was a show of the Five in Naples, Italy. There was a show that the Milan Triennale of '73 was a very important show that Rossi and Scolari and others participated in, and the Five were in. There was a show called 10 Projects for Canareggio, which took place in '78 in Venice. There was the first architecture biennale that Vittorio Grigotti and I participated in '76. So I'm talking about in the space of 10 years, let's say, there was a show in 73, 76, 80, 84. There were lots of shows, right?
But from
name me an important show, and when I'm talking about a didactic show that has an ideological punch, other than a couple of shows maybe that Jeff Kipnis has done, and I'm not speaking of Barry's shows, but we're talking about didactic ideological shows.
Right. So, but you haven't lost. You haven't. You think the same strategy can work. I would say, of course, the 32 show here was the reference point for the Decon show, but the first show was trying to package and market a kind of ideal product. Right. The Decon show was much more focused on undoing an already.
See, I would argue that Philip was trying to undo by calling it an international style, and I've written about that.
Right.
That Philip was also playing a double game, that he calling it the international style, international being left, style being right. Philip was taking the left ideology out of modernism, which it was up until that point, and packaging it for American consumption. And I think what he was doing in this show is taking the left ideology either out of constructivism or out of deconstruction, and I can't tell which side is which, and packaging it for another kind of consumption.
Right, but in this case, that kind of consumption, in my opinion, is an undoing. This is what I mean by poison pill. So in other words, that time in the late 80s called for a different strategy. So I'm interested in, Bernard, I'm interested in your thoughts on, number one, would you still see a role for such an exhibition today, and would the strategy necessarily have to be unique to today?
There's one thing which is very interesting in Peter's list of exhibitions during a certain period. Everyone is trying to define itself against something else. You've heard me say that before. You had a magazine, Peter, and you called it Oppositions.
Right.
When it folded, it was replaced by a magazine called Assemblage. And then the next one was called Grey Room. Oppositions was sort of, disappearing. And there's a whole period of history through the 20th century which is about a series of confrontation. You use the word ideology, that's correct. They were ideological confrontation. Now, one could venture the argument that the deconstructivist show, or the deconstruction discussion, actually made it impossible to have those simple binary oppositions. It was impossible to be on this side rather than on that side, as everything had become possible. Anything goes. Not surprisingly, those who try to have an argument call themselves the anti-critical or the post-critical in order to avoid it. So it's a little more difficult today to have a show, since you don't have a sparring partner against which to exchange blows.
No, but you could. I think that any number of people in the audience, including Barry, could find there are sparring partners out there. Well, not for us maybe, but I think if you wanted to really have a go at things, certainly the ideology of sustainability, the ideology of the digital. There are a lot of issues that people would take issue with today, which and return to say an architectural discourse. And there are plenty of young architects, some of them who are in this audience, some not so young, who still wave the banner for something other than what we see as the mainstream today. and so therefore there could be an oppositional show of a different sort.
But
it wouldn't be like the Biennale of last fall, which was a sort of discount supermarket of everything that was going. But it would be
including
something
you,
else.
including you.
Yeah, no, I'm
Yeah.
I'm guilty.
Yeah. But I mean, the reason I think I think you can, as we look back 25 years to construct some kind of memory of that moment and why that moment seemed to have a bigger effect than was predicted. It really, the construction of that memory will be completely determined by our perception of what today's environment is. In other words, it'll be much more about today than it is about 1988. I mean, it will be anyway for other people to make the...
But Decon died very quickly.
But
okay,
let me suggest the show that it could be made. It would be called iconism. And to see to which extent a whole generation or several generations of architects have been absolutely obsessed by the making of icons. And from whether you want to start with the Bilbao effect or with any current piece of work. The day before yesterday, I was in Dallas, and I saw in Dallas and Fort Worth, two buildings in Fort Worth by Piano and by, no, actually one by Piano, the sculpture collection, and the Louis Kahn building. It's fascinating to see Louis Kahn doesn't give a damn about doing an icon. You just don't even know where the entrance is, right? And then you look at two buildings recently completed, one by OMA Rex Ramkoolhaas, the Wiley Theatre, and the other one, the Perot Science Museum by Tom Main. And they shout icon, 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 and they use analogies. They use the analogy of the curtain for the or the metaphor of the curtain for the theater. They use the earth and the earthquakes for Tom Main. In other words, they play with imagistic, with iconic subject that can be understood by a very large public. In other words, I'm wondering whether our media-oriented culture has turned us as architects, because I'm guilty sometimes as well, as populist despite ourselves. And so maybe that iconism show will be the sort of thing that people would turn against and go to the next step.
So it occurs to me there's a possible formula then, which is something like today you have super big building and super small or flat shows. And at the time in '88 was a big exhibition, but if you think about it, mainly the projects were little in the sense of unbuilt conceptual research. You know, there was even Geary's own house, which is anyway important to note, was 10 years earlier, was 1978 project. And if any, in a sense, the rivals for capturing the key argument made in the exhibition about structure was made on the basis of the rooftop apartment of Kopp Himmelblau and Frank's house. So basically the central argument was 10 years earlier, but again it was treated by him as a little project, not a public project, not a project to necessarily be seen. You were with the conceptual side of La Valette. I mean, basically it was a series of little projects that were extraordinarily artificially made to sing the same song, but it sounds like a song sung by a bunch of little things is louder and more effective than a song sung by a bunch of big things. We have a world full of super big projects. I mean, pretty much every architect is generating countless books, countless exhibitions, countless statements. I mean, it's full on all the time. And what interests me is whether in that environment of today, one can focus the conversation as abruptly and as arrogantly as was possible in 1988.
But I think, to follow on what Bernard was saying, There are differences in the icons, Bernard. Some icons, you and I would agree, make critical statements, make, as it were, cultural and philosophic statements, and others don't. We don't have to name names, but they're around. And I would have thought that's the interesting difference. The icons that have a certain social, cultural value and the others that don't. And I think you could elaborate that very easily.
Well, your story about Bilbao reminds me that in the backstory, there was this meeting, and I remember saying that the real function of this exhibition would be to mark this work and demonstrate that the people in the show were finished. Right? And at the end of that, Gary came up to me and said, I really like what you said. You put a gun to my head, but you're wrong. Just you wait. I'm not finished. And Bilbao was just the next move. So, and I would say that's true of most of the architects in the exhibition. The exhibition acted for them, for you guys, as a kind of clearing and a marking of a previous phase of research. And you, all of you in your own ways, headed off in very different directions, as was hoped. I mean, the biggest nightmare for that show would have been a kind of stylistic coherence, but this with one exception, that coherence of one, everybody else just took it as an opportunity to again restart and do divergent work. Perhaps not by accident, there was quite a move from little unbuilt theoretical work to significant work in the world with all of the people concerned. The peak being, of course, Zaha's kind of famous first statement as an extraordinary designer at a moment in time in which it was never imagined that stuff could or would be built. And to her incredible credit, she has done something that no one would have predicted at that time, which is to simply insist that absolutely that would be built. And it seemed to me that's partially true for all of you. There are significant large parts of the world which are being
but also
given to you guys,
Bernard, let's
work on.
Take the icon subject, because I think it is an interesting one. There is also, because of the downturn, the recession, because of the economic conditions that find themselves in Europe, basically, in Italy, Spain, Portugal, there's been a reaction to the Zaha's, etc. Several of her projects have been put on hold. The Big Turkey project in Istanbul. There are, our project in Spain has been put on hold. Another large project we're doing in Naples is on, a hold. So there is a reaction, a true economic reaction to this splurge that you said, and rightly was going on, let's say, in the first 10 years of the new century.
I'm always reminded of a very important text, 1951, Hermann Brock, who talks about Wagner and talks about kitsch. And I always felt that, and he says that anybody who is not, who tries to be, Wagner is, of course Wagner is not kitsch, but anybody who tries to be Wagner is kitsch. And possibly you could say that Frank Gehry and Zaha Hadid are today's Wagners, but anybody who tries to imitate them are kitsch. Hence, a large part of the iconist discussion is kitsch.
Yes.
But just to stay momentarily on the same theme, in order to reproduce the conditions of the late 80s, if we still believe in an exhibition of today that continues the sort of avant-garde impulse, you would be looking for a series of works by people who have been doing good things for a long time, but a little bit under the radar, or a little bit in the clubs, or the back scene, or curious magazines that are not the dominant magazines, have had to invent new strategies of education and production, even new techniques of representation in order to make the arguments that they make. and that at a certain moment in time you could lift them out of a relative obscurity and suddenly place them on a completely different stage, which, given the fact that they've been like musicians playing the clubs for a long time, when they get the opportunity to hit the stage, they know what to do and they deliver. But this argument, which presupposes a kind of clubby scene, institute, architectural association, which is an oppositional space for experimental work opposed to the market, and even if we place between the market the museum, we may not be living in this moment in the same kind of topography. There may no longer be a line between the clubs, the schools, the representational systems, the museums, and the client. It's very possible that we no longer have those incubation territories, and we have now generations of architects who, from the very beginning of their thinking, project their work in a very sophisticated way to the maximum distance. Big book, big shows, magazines. Actually, it's relatively easy to start your own school. Almost every architect I know is the head of a school that didn't exist 5 years ago. So in other words, it's a very it puts the Museum of Modern Art in a very different relationship to this landscape, which is a landscape of extraordinary expertise that I think didn't exist at the time.
Let's face one real situation. You cannot raise money for architecture shows today. Number one, not as easily as you could in 1970 and 1973, etc. There isn't that kind of money around. There isn't a kind of market. There's a really an enormous difference in the museum culture, blockbuster shows, and look, when Michael Graves and I started in 1963, we had done nothing. We were given $1 million by an insurance company to work on the Linear City. That's how we got into a show at MoMA. You can't find that kind of money to give to monkeys today. They give them peanuts, you know. That's so it's very different, Mark. Yeah, but you couldn't. The institutions couldn't support, even if there were the climate. You wouldn't get
Right,
that.
but just to summarize, because I'm sure we should join with the audience to keep going, but to summarize, I think the conclusion of this sort of pathetically partial conversation is that you cannot imagine a show. It would be ridiculous to imagine a show of the same type in the world of today.
No.
Right?
Right.
It's not on.
People.
I think we should open it up. Yeah, I think we should open it up to the. Are there? Yeah, I think they're traveling mics.
Yeah. Barry.
Thank you. Your history stopped at the Deconstructivist show. Your history of exhibitions and prior to it, you were talking about Stuart Vreda's show, and then it went up to exhibitions of the Deconstructivist show. And then you stopped. But what happened immediately after that was the competition for the tower, in which several of the architects for the Deconstructivist show were in the competition. Bernard and Rem in particular, and Herzog and Miron, and it was won by Taniguchi. Then Terry Riley started to do a whole series of polemic shows about style and ideas. And it looks like MoMA, for me, just as an outsider, it always seemed like it had a very uneasy relationship to the Deconstructivist show, was embarrassed to have happened it. The one project that was the centerpiece of Mark's essay, which was the Biocentrum project, wasn't acquired. And so the thing I'm sort of interested in is how you feel about, I mean, this seems like an orphan, the Deconstructivist show. Philip was forced out of the museum circle almost immediately after. He was not listened to at all in terms of the choice of the building design. So there is a whole court culture at MoMA which is taking a kind of opportunist relationship to that show, but at the same time never embracing any of its ideas or principles, including in its shows after that. So I just sort of wonder, where are you on this problem of the question of the show and the status of MoMA in relationship to advocacy of architectural, social, cultural advocacy?
Are you asking me?
Yes, of course. Since you're the only one who actually works for MoMA.
Okay, I'm trying to decode I'm trying to decode some of the history in there, which I think is a rather peculiar interpretation. I don't think the Decon show was necessarily but others would have to correct me because I wasn't there. Any kind of catalyst for Philip Johnson falling out of favor in the museum. I think that's to give the show a lot more credit. What fascinates me about the show historically is it is perhaps with Terry's light construction accepted maybe the last great effort to create a stylistic synthesis. And I think looking back at it in 25 years later, and if you do reread the catalog, it is so consciously related to the International Style Show, and in many ways feels, and it's gratifying to hear Mark bring in the kind of, this fascinating relationship between historical instrumentality and avant-garde. Feels very, very much the same way, and I was going to say in relationship to Mark's comments a moment ago, when you look at the work that was in the International Style Show, it too seems as much the end of something as and it was the beginning of what it proclaimed to be. I'm happy to speak about I've spoken many times about what I'm up to. I didn't really think that was a subject tonight, but I'm happy to. Among the many things that we've done is actually to return to a singular event of the 60s that Peter remembers because he was part of it, the New City. And I think that it's possible through the types of laboratories we've been doing to invite people to take on work that's not being asked for by the marketplace, by competitions, by magazines, and in fact to put ideas and problems and ask relatively, I think, people that might fit Mark's category of kind of being not totally out there in bright lights to take it on. And also, I think, actually, to take very, very big risks, to be willing to exhibit work that you commit to at the moment that you set a problem, that you don't know actually what's going in the gallery. And in that sense, that is almost without precedent in the museum, to be willing to commit to set up an activity, to set up a discourse about issues that seem to matter, and there will be many more to come, and to commit to showing the results. So I think in many ways, too, that responds to the media culture that we live in. This is also possible because of the internet, because people tweet and show up at PS1 when we have the workshops, and there's a different kind of engagement than in the 1980s when people were, there was almost a kind of court culture about what one knew, who was on the list, who was not on the list. It's a very different...
Don't you think it's one of your problems that there is no architectural critic at the New York Times? I mean, don't you think that's rather strange?
I actually been thinking very much that we need to have an evening like this about the state of architectural criticism.
Thank you.
So, I think there's a lot more.
But just a quick insert to pick up again on Jeff's point. I think, and these two things are related. I think in a moment in which when a young designer can have a million people engage with her blog, the role of the Museum of Record is already completely different. So I see, for example, the projects with the Buell on public space, on the flooding and all that, represent a kind of shift of, a totally understandable shift, almost you could say, into research. You could see, in a way, museums taking a kind of research direction as distinct from a kind of advocacy of aesthetic impulses. But I just want to return to Jeff's first point. I mean, it was very, very palpable at the time that the museum hated Philip. And an enormous part of his pleasure was that he could roam there was not a single door that would not be open to him, because it had to be open to him, because he was literally, it was as it were the ghost of the institution in the institution itself. So he and the show he was putting in were, I think, despised. So I think you're exactly right. Even you're very polite when you call it an orphan. It was like, at least an orphan you sort of, have a sort of relationship with. This is an incident regretted by the institution. So it's funny, I think I was saying to Peter, or maybe it was Bernard, when we were in the gallery, I had a little bit the opposite reaction to your question, which is that it was nice to see that with the passage of time, this is somehow now part of the narrative. You could say that's because we're all, old and gone, but I think it is somehow this kind of uncomfortable moment was being incorporated. I remember certain senior figures in the museum who remembered decades later, going up to about 5 years ago, the way certain things in the catalogue were able to bypass the editorial regime that was meant to. So it was an offence to the museum. The reason I'm saying this, I think it's entirely okay for the museum to not feel great about that event. I mean, I think it would be weird to have, in a way, loved Philip for having misbehaved so much.
It's true, but I do think it takes its place. When you read through the list of some 300 architecture exhibitions that have taken place here in 80 years, there are only a handful that you think everyone knows those. Those are landmarks. Those are kind of the rocks that still stand up above the water even at high tide. Historians like us can reconstruct step by every year. There was this one, there was this one, there was this one. And so I think it was also an orphan of a different sort, which was it was a succès de scandale, much as the international style show was. If you actually look at the statistics, very few people actually saw the international style show. It's completely outsized in relationship to its real audience, and I think it's that phenomena that interests me. It obviously takes a different nexus in different moments of media development. I think we should open up to other questions in the.
Hi, good evening. I come from Chile. I study architecture there. So we have a big influence about the modernism in architecture. And there's a lot of fear to create new shapes in the design process. At school, for example, we are not allowed to do this stuff. They just reprobate us, maybe in all schools. And so my question goes to how may I say, how do you scare, or are you scared or how you enfront this design process with fear? Is fear a tool for design? So say it's too much or it's too less in this edge line of the, how may I say, of the project? It's an open question for you.
Any of us, the three of us, could respond to this question. We are all involved with architectural education. So I would simply make one point. There's some schools where they know what the right answer is before you start designing. And there are other schools where they just ask the question and hope to see something different. So
I think also I think there are times in the architectural culture of this country, or let's say this country, where the profession sometimes is taking the lead and sometimes the schools are taking the lead. And I'm not sure that we know where that leadership is today, whether it's in the profession or in the schools. I don't think it's clear, whereas it certainly was clear when the Decon show was certainly clear in '32. It was certainly clear at other times that the schools were doing it, and there were other times when the profession was doing it. I mean, there were, great leaders that, when Le Corbusier and Mies and Kahn and Wright and others were practicing, the schools were behind. But now, where are those giants, that are practicing and leading in a certain cultural and critical and social way? I don't see them, and yet I don't see it in the schools. I mean, one of the most vibrant schools, we were talking about it today, is SciArc, which is, and akin to the AA in a certain way. It's a school outside of the academic environment, very, very exciting school, but I'm not sure it's a leader. And I'm not sure there are many professionals that I would say have taken over the mantle of leadership like even Philip did in his own way. We don't have a Philip Johnson. We don't have someone leading the circus. And I think that's one of the issues.
Yeah, I mean, you're describing religion, which is the religion of the right angle, which is almost the only thing you can't find in nature. So that thing we call normal, actually normal, the right angle, is a cultural artifact which has enormous resonance particularly in Western culture, and architects have been asked to be caretakers of this. So when your teachers say they don't want other shapes, this is not coming just from a kind of narrow-mindedness on their part. This is understood to be part of a legacy of responsibility by which the architect treats the right angle and orthogonal geometry not as a cultural artifact, but as as our version of the cosmic resonance of the universe and so on. I'm allergic to the separation of the political and the visual, which comes so easily, as if the political is always hidden behind and the visual is always in your face. One can perfectly use the language of right angles to produce a deeply subversive and destabilizing commentary. Indeed, you could argue that there's nothing inherently destabilizing about any of the projects that were in the Deconstructivist show. In fact, the catalog says exactly that these don't, as it were, take away force from the right angle or make geometry work a different way. They make you think about the moves that we make. Think about rooms like this one. So my sense is that 99.999% of schools of architecture are devoted to stopping you from moving the field forward. And that also seems just fine, because imagine that every school in the world wanted to change the rules. Wouldn't be that interesting. And I think there's not a single architectural statement or a piece of writing that was not driven by frustration with religion and frustration with rules, and in particular with what you mentioned, fear. And I mean, if anybody does anything good, that's because they were terribly afraid when they were doing it. So if you're feeling afraid, it sounds good to me.
Maybe one or two more questions from the audience.
I would like to sort of propose if, despite the fact that there is no definitive, cohesive treatise on deconstructivism, but deconstructivism is more about the fact that it's what hasn't been said than what has been said, meaning that it's something that people distinctively know what it is, but we just don't want to say it or claim it. As Kipnis says, it's orphaned. And I doubt there's any young architects in this room would not know what a decon architecture is by its architect and it's their work. Of course, we can never say that it's a deconstructivist architecture by specific philosophy, but we sort of distinctively have become accustomed to know decon as a sort of distinctive style, formally anyway, and a sort of a kind of a quasi-philosophical idea. So, and I think maybe, just maybe, and I'm just throwing a sort of stone in the kind of a really large water here, maybe deconstructivism is about getting away from this kind of a cohesive thought of treatise of knowledge, but it's about odd juxtaposition, and it's formally definitely, you can see it on the work of what Mark definitely said. Daniel Lipschkin still continues to derive deconstructivist work today through his architecture. So it's about odd juxtaposition, and this may be the reason why there isn't a cohesive treatise on deconstructivism, whether it's deconstruction or it's some offshoot of a Russian constructivism.
When I hear you, I'm reminded of a definition of pornography. I don't know what it is, but I can recognize it when I see it, right? So if that's the way we should look at deconstructivism, well, we can do that. But I think maybe the issue is the question of Mark has brought up religion. You know my view about dogma, although there is a young architecture group that has decided to call themselves dogma. Maybe this era, the one we live in at this moment, may have a wonderful, freedom. That is not to have to fight dogmas anymore. And for a long time, the history of architecture was about trying, like the church, to determine a series of rules and regulations. At this moment, something is sort of shifting. Where it is going, that I do not know.
I want to add one thing. First of all, I think the reference to the missing Mr. Libeskind from today was not to suggest that he was carrying the flag, but quite the reverse. I think you missed it, by the way, and maybe it was too subtle. But I think there's an enormous difference between stylistic works, and I think this is what Bernard was trying to say, iconic work that has very little social, cultural, philosophic meaning in the best sense of the word, what I would call an architectural project, and in the best sense of that, what that means. And much of what is being done today may look like what this show was about in its innocence, by the way, but I think has very little to do with that. And I think we have to realize that much of what we see is just as bad as the kitsch historicism that we were seeing in postmodernism. And maybe you can't cure any of these things.
Yeah, just on that point, I think the architectural projects that are, the architect, if we can say that, produces a hesitation in the perception of everyday life, right? And it's not that the architect is telling you what to do or what to think or how to live, but interrupts you, you see your world, and you, in that moment, you could think differently. So the architect tries to create a situation in which you might think, that you might change direction. And therefore, architects believe very strongly that the possibility of a better society lies within every project, because every project, no matter how small, could produce this hesitation which makes you see your world differently, think of a different world, and so on. I think the same thing can be said of an exhibition, that its greatest ambition is that people hesitate and reflect. It doesn't instruct you what to go ahead and do, but you, from that point, see things slightly different. And I think, therefore, if you were to identify what for me was a real ambition, the ambition was to change the language with which architectural projects were being described. And I do think another kind of history can map the way in which certain concepts became, as it were, naturalized by that event. I'm super proud to say that almost no shapes were naturalized, and I would like to imagine that if you think you know what deconstructivist architecture looks like, and you put into a pile all the projects that fit into that category, and you have another pile, which is all the ones that don't, there'll be almost nothing in the... You may find SIAC, by the way. You may find quite a lot of SIAC projects in there. For all of your newfound interest in the West Coast,
You think it's much different than what's at Columbia?
Let me just move forward. But I just think there's very little out there. In other words, yes, of course, I continue to meet people that actually were very affected by the exhibition. They were affected as students or visiting it. But none of them I understand to mean I therefore now design in that particular way. They just say that affected me, and I think that's the greatest ambition for an exhibition. Now, if we live in a world of this sort of uber communication that we live in today, what it means to produce a hesitation of that order is clearly very different. I certainly don't have the ability to do it. I'm sure there is another set of techniques and strategies, with which one could produce a kind of hesitation and reflection. And for sure, architecture has a huge set of questions and a huge set of responsibilities in the world that we operate today. But we don't seem to have developed the techniques for focusing collective wisdom. And I think architects are, sorry about the speech, architects are generally, I think, enormously interesting and thoughtful people. But if you take the millions of architects in the world, you can't really say that we found a way to galvanize that thinking. And part of the role of a museum or a school is to focus the thinking. And I think that was more the question for me. How would one, in this moment of time, focus discussion? But Bernard will say it better.
Focusing, yes, definitely. Restricting or forcing certain recipes, as architects have done, again, throughout so many periods, is something else. Editing, yes, but not being, again, I know too many talking about schools because very often that's where it starts, where there's certain ways of thinking which are already predetermined. And in reality, as we are in a world which is constantly changing, you mentioned sustainability. I don't want to get in that territory, but I do find fascinating as an architectural exercise to think that the water level is going to go up 30 feet, and what is it going to mean in terms of our cities? I'd love to design a project about this. So these are issues which have to be not with recipes, not with answers that we already know, but identify in our human contemporary conditions new problems that we can, as architects, determine, define, and therefore propose certain solutions.
Bernard, let's be honest here. LEED certificates are a marketing device today, not what you're talking about. Let's make sure we keep the conversation straight and not play to a... Yes. You're not talking about LEED certificates.
I'm not talking about LEED certificate. For those, you seem to all know what LEED certificate. It's a series of rules that the construction industry has determined in order supposedly to make savings in energy, but that in reality have far, far more to do with business and commerce and consumption.
I think I keep waiting for we've had several really salient moments when I thought that's a wonderful stopping point. I don't know that LEEDs should be. Let's take it perhaps as an example of something that we can react against as we look for the non-canonical. I want to thank you very much for being game for this, Bernard, Mark, Peter, and for reopening the debate. I can just say in one final note, the 3 times I've had the enormous pleasure at Columbia and here at MoMA to teach a course on the history of architecture exhibitions and ask students to work on one particular exhibition, and the number of hands that rushed to the front of the room wanting to work on the Decon exhibition is absolutely predictable each time. So if it's an orphan, I think it is an orphan with an extremely large audience, and it has left an extremely large shadow that is still of enormous interest to people who are studying and trying to imagine being an architect today. So anyway, thank you very much for coming. I hope those of you who haven't seen the show will see it upstairs, and that you will come up and join us for a drink, and there are books for sale. And I should also thank Leah Boreas, who's in the front row, who helped put tonight together. Thank you, Leah. So please join us up in the lobby.